Okay, I think we can kick off. So good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Barrett. I'm the director of the ESRI, and it really is a great pleasure to welcome everybody at today's webinar, where we'll be talking about the latest ESRI research on poverty, income inequality, and living standards in Ireland. So I want to say at the outset, this is work that was done by the Institute, but funded by our colleagues in the Community Foundation of Ireland. And it's an interesting little partnership, but I was just looking at the Community Foundation's website this morning, and just to read a couple of things where they have a section where they talk about what they stand for. And they say, we believe in an Ireland where everybody feels they belong, an Ireland where people are equal and communities thrive, an Ireland where everyone has a voice. We stand for a fair, caring and vibrant Ireland for now and the future. And actually, just in reading that, I mean, one of the things that struck me is that the Institute has a very long tradition going well back into the 1980s of doing analysis on issues around poverty and income inequality and living standards. So you have a sort of an interesting marriage here. On the one hand, that we have the Community Foundation and the sort of work they do, and the Institute and the sort of work we do. So I think it's great that the two organizations have been able to come together, and that with the foundation funding this work, the ESRI undertaking it, and we're going to have a good discussion today about the findings from the analysis. So the way we're going to structure the morning, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to invite Denise from the Community Foundation to say a few words. Then after that, my colleague Barra Roantree will go through the findings. And then we've got two responses, one from Kiernan of One Family, and then Senator Lynn Ruane will give a response as well. And then we're hoping we'll have about sort of maybe 15 or 20 minutes for questions towards the end. So we've got a very good number of attendees. As the sort of event unfolds, if you want to start submitting your questions through the Q&A function on the Zoom platform, that would be great. And we also have a Twitter hashtag. So from memory, and I should have written this down, Denise can correct me in a second if I'm wrong, but from memory, it's hashtag ESRI CFI. Okay, so hashtag ESRI CFI. So if people want to start tweeting reactions and comments and everything like that, that would be great. Okay, so with that, I'm eager to make sure we keep moving, so I don't want to take any more time, and let me hand over to Denise then at this point for some remarks. So Denise.
Great, thanks Alan, thanks very much, and welcome everybody, and hello to my fellow panelists as well. A couple of comments from me, just to echo what Alan said. We're really delighted to be partnering ESRI with this particular piece of research, and as many of you will know, it's one of three pieces, and the publication today has obviously already landed fairly substantially with lots of interest in it, which is obviously the object of the exercise. So many of you out there will know that there has been huge media coverage and interest generated, debate in the Seanad led by some of our senators, and really amplifying some of the issues that are so pertinent to Irish society, and as Alan articulated, to both the ESRI and to the Community Foundation. The fact that there's nearly 500 people on the webinar, in addition to the comments in the Oireachtas and the media coverage, I think shows that we've hit a nerve. Community Foundation and ESRI saw the information gap, and we're very lucky that one of our private donors echoed the interest and came forward, anonymously, to support the work. So the report covers a lot. I'm obviously not going to go through that. From our perspective, the findings are very stark. They're a reminder of the deep inequalities in Irish society and how they're deepening, and I think a wake-up call for all of us that are interested in equality in the country. Some of the headlines drawn from the research that are particularly pertinent for us at the Community Foundation, and I know for many of the panelists, the fact that young people today are in danger of being far worse off than their parents because of falling incomes and rising house prices. They're not recent problems, but I think what the report does do is really amplify the fact that the year we've lived in has exacerbated those issues. For us at Community Foundation, we believe it should be our goal when you're passing on the baton to the next generation, that you're really trying to pass on a society that is fair, that is prosperous, better than the society we inherited, or at least as good as. And I suppose as a parent, it's deeply disturbing that this is not the case. I was very involved in marriage equality. We were very proud in Ireland that we led out on that aspect of equality. But I think what this report amplifies once again is that there are deep inequalities for communities across the country. Amplifying the issues for lone parents and those in homes where no member is getting paid work obviously is revealed and is of huge importance and interest to us at the Community Foundation. Huge tribute to the ESRI and the research team led by Barra and the other researchers here today. A shout out to Tina Roach, my predecessor and special advisor who worked with the team on this. And also really delighted and grateful to have Kiernan and Senator Lynn Ruane here today. Big fan of both. They're massive advocates and champions for equality. So what a fantastic team that we're going to listen to today. It's now up to us as funders, as communities, as advocates, as policymakers to decide what happens to these findings. And I suppose I conclude with the fact that this is one, as I said, of 3 reports. And what's really interesting with that is that any initiatives that are being undertaken can be really bold because we can measure them. So we can look at what the issues are and we can look at solutions and then track them as we try and work towards them collectively. For us, in conclusion, it's really important to work in partnership. That's our approach, and collaboratively. The issues are once again amplified. We can't ignore them. I think the government will be expecting us to raise them consistently. There is going to be, as many will know, a new policy on philanthropy coming out, and we'd like to work with the government. We hope that they see this partnership with the ESRI as a way that Community Foundation can come to the table for a better society. I'll finish quoting the United Nations. The United Nations has, during the pandemic, thrown out a challenge to world leaders. I'm throwing it out to us, saying as a planet, we need to recover better. So what's been shown today and the spotlight that the ESRI have put on Irish society, on our young people, on our lone parents, on those who are not working, and many others, is really showing that we're not immune to getting the recovery wrong. And as the UN would say, we have an opportunity as a country to recover better. So really looking forward to this morning, and thank you all very much.
Great, thanks so much, Denise. And I think you've sort of teed it up quite well. I always think ESRI research, sometimes we're evaluating policy and interrogating policy, and sometimes what we're trying to do is illuminate what are the big policy questions, what are the challenges that we face as a country. And I think the research today, I sort of see it as being part of that latter category, that really what we're trying to do is identify where are the challenges and where do people like yourselves then need to be sort of directing energies in addition to government, of course. So again, just great that we have the partnership. Okay, so at this point, I want to hand over to my colleague, Barra Roantree, who's led the research. And Barra, I think you're going to share your screen and then talk to us for about 20 minutes or so.
There we are. Thanks, Alan. Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button, as is, I think, standard. And now at this stage, for whatever 14 months that we are into the pandemic. Can I just reiterate, I suppose, first my appreciation and thanks to Denise, Tina, Emma and Jerry at the Community Foundation and their donors for funding this piece of work. It's really been great to be able to get the time to work on, I suppose, a long-term project looking at the long-term evolution of poverty, income inequality and living standards in Ireland. And as part of this project, and just want to kind of flag it at the outset, we've made available a spreadsheet on the ESRI website with kind of the main results here. And really that kind of reflects that, going back to 87 in terms of some of those main indicators. And that will be available and that will be updated with each year during this research program that the Community Foundation are funding. And so that's there, and that really kind of part of the rationale for this for this project was because of the lack of consistent long run indicators and our ability to kind of look back over time and identify what are some of the key challenges facing the country on these issues. So I'm going to give you just a brief overview of some of the main findings. There really is a huge amount in the report, and thanks to my co-authors Ivan, Bertrand and Ali for helping us putting this all together. I would encourage you to go download the report from our website and read through it. We've tried to make it as accessible and clear as possible. There's hopefully very few words wasted. So even though there's a lot of material there, you won't hopefully find it too difficult to read through. So just in terms of the main findings, I'm just going to flag a few. I'm going to tell you about them first, and then just walk you through and show you them, and finish up by talking about some of the implications for policy. So our first kind of finding, one of the things that we highlight, is that income growth in Ireland has actually been incredibly strong and progressive over the last 3 decades. Now, alongside that, it was also volatile. We know we've had the Great Recession, we've had a lost decade in the aftermath of that, in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But it really is the case that income growth was strong and helps those on lowest incomes most. So just one stat that illustrates that is that growth on average was about 3% for the population as a whole across the distribution, adjusted for for inflation. There's about 3.6% for the lowest income fifth of the population, and about 2.7% for the highest income fifth. So we had this growth over this period as a whole, that was really quite progressive. It lifted incomes at the bottom by more than incomes at the top. Now, what that has resulted means that inequality, as we measure it on pretty much any basis, in particular the Gini coefficient and the 90-10 ratio, 2 common measures, they're at the lowest recorded level in 2019. So things were looking good in terms of overall, in terms of income growth inequality on the eve of the pandemic. However, there also has been, and our research really tries to highlight this, consistently high rates of poverty and deprivation for certain groups. As has been mentioned in the outset, lone parents really stand out as one of these groups that have kind of faced consistently a high incidence of low living standards. But that's also the case for single adults living on their own and with no unpaid work, and households where there's no unpaid work more generally. Those are groups that really haven't seen maybe the same growth as others that we've seen across the distribution. Their living standards are still quite low. Many of them face some very low living standards. And so that link to the absence of any unpaid work is something we're going to come back to in terms of the policy conclusions at the end. The third, I think, key finding is something we highlighted earlier in the week, and that's that there's evidence of emergent intergenerational inequality. So it's not inconsistent for income inequality across the population as a whole to have fallen, while there's still being some groups left behind, and for gaps between other groups to be opening up. And so I think that's kind of an important kind of context for how we discuss inequality. It's important that we're precise in, well, where are the real challenges that we face, so that we can look at options for addressing those. So as I'll tell you shortly, young adults were hardest hit by job losses during the pandemic, and that risks compounding a labour market that never really recovered from the Great Recession, the financial crisis. And on top of that, that interacts with the housing issues and increasing exposure to the private rental sector. So that's just a very brief overview of the main findings. I'm going to talk you through each of them now kind of in turn. Again, there are a huge number of findings in the research, so I can't possibly try to cover them, and I'm not going to try to do that. But just kind of to pick up then on those that I mentioned. The first, that disposable income growth was strong and progressive. What this figure is showing you is the average annualized real growth rate, adjusted for prices, in disposable income, that is after taxes and benefits. And I'm showing this across the income distribution, where I'm breaking up the population into 100 equally sized groups or centiles, ordered from lowest income on the left to highest income on the right. And what I'm then plotting is then what was the average growth at each centile of that distribution, so across the income distribution. And what you can see by that line sloping downwards is that it is the case that growth was progressive. Growth was strongest on average for those in the bottom half of the income distribution, and particularly at the very bottom of the distribution, proportionally to their income, then at the top. And that is something that actually not very many countries have managed. And I think it is something that it's important to kind of recognise and understand why that is. And that's something we're hoping to do again in part of the research programme in future years. Understand why it was that growth was so broad-based and progressive over this period as a whole. Just for contrast, I don't think it's necessarily the case that we should always compare ourselves to Britain. That's sometimes a low benchmark to set in terms of particularly earnings growth or employment. But by contrast, if you did this for Britain, what you'd see is that growth was about half the level and was also regressive. It wasn't as high. It was lower for those in the bottom income distribution than top. So we have managed to, over the last 30 years, achieve growth in a way that has been broadly shared, and that is something to be proud to I think be kind of note on. As a result, it's left some of the key income inequality measures at their lowest recorded level. So here I'm showing you the Gini coefficient in the dark blue line. That's a measure of income inequality that goes from between 0 and 1, where 0 is if everyone has the same income, 1 is if one person has all the income. And what you can see from that is that it's kind of declined since 1987. It's gone from about 0.33 down to less than 0.3. So that's actually, in terms of inequality of the Gini coefficient, quite a big change. But we've not, and that's kind of a summary measure across the population as a whole. It doesn't necessarily capture the very top and the very bottom. It's kind of quite sensitive to the middle. But if you look at something like the 90-10 ratio, which is just the ratio of the income of the person 10% from the top against that of the person 10% at the bottom, that gap has also narrowed over the past 30 years. So we see it kind of increased a little bit over the 90s, then it kind of came down substantially over the 2000s, rose again during the crash before falling during the recovery. So it's the case as well, if you look at, we've got many other measures of income inequality in the report. They all, for disposable income, after tax and benefit income, show a decline over this period. And again, that's to do with the progressive growth that we saw over this period. However, and this is important, it's not, decline in income inequality is by no means the whole story, and is not inconsistent with groups being left behind. So we've also, we saw that across the population as a whole, rates of poverty and deprivation have also declined. So I'm showing you here the deprivation rate in blue and the poverty rate in the orange series. And we can see that, both of those kind of declined over the 2000s, the 90s and 2000s before rising, particularly deprivation, rising over the 2010s in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And then again, both have been kind of falling for the most part during the recovery, with a tick upwards, a worrying tick up on the eve of the pandemic. Now, so deprivation here is if you, the idea is if you can't afford 2 or more items from a list of 10 essentials, things that we might consider essential, being able to have a new coat or new shoes, those kind of things. Whereas poverty is kind of a measure of where you are relative to middle income. So if you're below the poverty line, you're below 60% of median, the middle income. And so both of those, they're measures that get at slightly different things, but they both kind of point to the instance of low living standards. So in general, across the population, we've seen this over the long horizon decline. However, there are some groups who we really highlight have faced consistently high rates of poverty and deprivation. That's shown here for lone parents. What you see is that these rates, it was the case that back in the 1990s, the early 1990s, about 2/3 of lone parents were in deprivation or poverty. That declined over the 90s, continued declining over the 2000s, but has risen again over the crash. And even though there's been some recovery in recent years, it is still the case that more than 1/3 of lone parents are in poverty or deprivation. And that has been the case going back as far as the data that we have cover. So, it really is the case that lone parents stand out as a group who experience these very low living standards and who, as a result, we might want to have particular concerns about. That's kind of related to another group that we highlight in the report, which is single working age adults not in paid work. I'm showing the same figure here. I'm showing you how it compares to the population as a whole. But for this group of population, again, what we see is that there's been consistently high rates of poverty and deprivation amongst that group. What's also kind of concerning is that there hasn't, until maybe the latest year of data, been a dip down. We saw kind of, even while the recovery was progressing for other groups, single adults of working age who aren't in paid work were kind of, the rate of poverty and deprivation, or the rate of poverty was rising amongst these. Now, that's particularly of concerning, I think, in the context of something we'll come back to later, which is the pandemic and the link between paid work and poverty and deprivation, because I think that has the potential to really exacerbate some of what was in general kind of things improving over the last few years up to the eve of the pandemic. However, there's another group which we were again highlighting earlier in the week, and in terms of the labour market impact, it really is the case that the pandemic has hit the employment of young adults hardest. What I'm showing you here is the change in the employment rate indexed against the rate just before the pandemic. If you can remember back to 2020, January or February of then, when it seems like more than a year ago, much more than a year ago at this stage. But what this shows you is that employment rates for essentially just fell with a very clear age pattern. So we saw a fall of more than half in the employment rate for young adults aged 15 to 24. We saw it fall by about a quarter for those aged 25 to 29 in the initial lockdown, in that kind of the quarter 2 of 2020. We saw then a bit of a recovery over the summer as things recovered for all age groups, but it was still the case that young adults had seen the largest falls in employment. And then along, in terms of Christmas, when we had kind of things tightening back up again, we again saw it was the case that, employment fell by most for younger adults. We go into some of the reasons for that in the report. What really stands out is that young adults are disproportionately likely to work in things like hospitality, retail, arts and leisure. Those sectors we know have been hit hardest by the pandemic. And also those are the sectors that we might worry mightn't recover as fast. It kind of depends on how the virus evolves, depends on how international travel evolves. And so I think it's a reason for some concerns and prompt some policy discussion that we'll come to at the end. However, what I think is particularly concerning about these job losses and falling on young adults, is that this is also the case. This was also the case in the financial crisis, in the Great Recession that followed. So really the job losses that we've seen during the pandemic, I think, risk compounding the still lingering effects of the financial crisis. So I'm showing you the same thing here, the change in employment rate, except now it's relative to its level just before the financial crisis in 2007. And what again we see is that there was huge falls in employment for younger adults. There was, we saw that particularly for teenagers. Now some of that was moving into staying in education longer, which we can see as a good thing and will have delivered longer and positive results. But particularly for those in their 20s and early 30s, we saw that fall in employment, and that that hadn't really gotten back to where it was even on the eve of the crisis. So you can see that for 20 to 24-year-olds. You can see in the kind of the dark blue series. You can see that even on the eve of the crisis for 25 to 29-year-olds, employment rates weren't back to where they had been before the financial crisis. Whereas for older workers, for those particularly aged 35 plus, by about 2016, employment rates had gotten back to where they were. Now in the report we go into this and more. You see kind of similar things in terms of earnings. And again, I think that the fact that we've had these two shocks disproportionately affecting younger workers in so short succession is really a concern for worry, particularly when you add to this that we know that emigration was mostly amongst those younger age groups, and that so in a way that is artificially flattering these figures, that these figures don't account for the fact that many people left and not all of them have come back. So that hit to the labour market, and that real poor labour market that young adults are facing is a reason for concern, as is the increasing exposure to the private rental sector. So what I'm showing you here is the percentage of different generations that own their own homes by age. And what you can see, if we start off by people born in the 1940s, which is the line up here at the top, our data kind of cover them in their kind of late 40s, early 50s. And we see that around 90% of them owned their home at that stage. If we look at people in the 1950s, it kind of steps down. There's about 5% lower at the same ages. Again for the 1960s, and again even larger for the 1970s. And then again we see that for the 1980s, and it looks like the 1990s guys will follow that suit. So what that means is that by age 30, while it was the case that 60% of those born in the 1960s had owned their own home, it had almost halved for those born in the 1980s. There's big falls as well for people in the 1970s, and we can see that it gets increasingly hard to become a homeowner as you get older. It becomes increasingly hard to get a mortgage that will kind of is long enough that it can lead to affordable repayments, and so that really is what's driving in large part greater exposure to the private rental sector, where ESRI research over the last 30 years has really highlighted that there are acute affordability issues, that the issues of affordability in the housing market, work by my colleagues Conor O'Toole, Rachel Slaymaker and Kiernan McQuinn have shown, is really concentrated in that private rental sector, particularly the private rental sector, which isn't covered by supports like rent supplement or HAP. And so this in turn risks compounding what we see in terms of the poor labour market facing young adults, and really should be cause for concern for policymakers. So I'm going to just finish up now by kind of drawing out a few of the implications for policy of these kind of key findings. I think the first one that kind of has some serious implications for policy is the really tight link between income poverty, material deprivation, and the absence of anyone in paid work in the household. So firstly, I think that should give rise to maybe concerns about the impact of pandemic-related job losses. We've seen huge falls in employment, and we know that they're concentrated in certain sectors. And if the recovery is slower than we hope it will be, it's going to be particularly slow in those sectors that have been kind of hit, in those sectors that they can't work from home, that involves interacting with people. So we're talking retail, leisure, hospitality. If international tourism doesn't come back as maybe as quick as it might, that's going to mean a slower recovery there. And given the close link between not having anyone in paid work in the household and poverty and deprivation, that suggests that we might see increases in poverty and deprivation in the years ahead until we get a recovery that has really kind of come back and brought back employment to the levels it was at. It also, though, I think, highlights the role that social welfare plays in for those who are seeking a tool to address poverty and deprivation. So, there's a lot of focus maybe about kind of earnings and minimum wages, but really I think what this kind of shows that unlike in other countries, it isn't the case that poverty is a kind of an in-work phenomenon in Ireland. In Ireland, it really is closely linked to people being out of work, and so from that point of view, I think we need to think carefully about how do we direct and target resources towards those groups if that's something that we want to address. And on a kind of a more optimistic note, I just want to kind of point something that we highlight something we point to in the report, which is I suppose the experience of pensioners. So Towards the end of the 1990s, about almost 1 in 2 of those aged 65 or more was below the poverty line. So we'd seen a sharp increase in poverty over the 90s, over late 90s amongst those amongst pensioners. And it was then decided that, okay, this needed to be addressed. The rate of the state pension, the maximum rate of it, was increased by more than 50% in real terms over the 2000s. And what we saw was that pensioners went from being the age group most at risk of poverty to the age group being least at risk over the course of about a decade. So I think that really, for me, highlights just the role that the state and the capacity that the state has to affect social change when it is really an item of primary concern. So I think from that point of view, what our report highlights is that the social welfare system really is a powerful tool, and that we should look at it if there are issues there that we want to address around poverty and deprivation. And that maybe sometimes falls into the background of discussions. Second kind of key implication for policy is that the prospects of those born in the 1980s and early 1990s and subsequently should be a real cause of concern. So what we've highlighted is that there was a very poor labour market. And what I think this raises concerns about is that there's the potential for persistent scarring effects on later life outcomes, as is kind of referred to in economic research and research more general. And so what we mean by this is that there is now a really strong body of research which links poor prospects in the labour market when you're finishing up school, be that secondary school, be that further education, or be that college, and later life outcomes. We know that graduating, finishing those educations when the labour market is poor can leave earnings and employment lower for, on average even, for up to 10 years, with greater impacts at the bottom. But we also know that the impacts of that scarring go beyond the labour market. They feed through into a higher likelihood of people being charged with criminal offences later in life. They feed through to different political attitudes later in life. So it really is, I think, crucial that we address some of these issues about stagnant living standards amongst younger adults today. From that point of view, we raise two things in particular in the report. The first is the need to ramp up capacity in high quality training programs. If it is the case that, things like hospitality tourism are going to be slower recovery than otherwise, it's not good that we have people sitting around waiting for that to recover. And it's important that we try link in people with other jobs that are there, or give them the opportunities to retrain to jobs that will be there more quickly. From this point of view as well, we highlight the fact that the importance of caseworkers in the public employment service. Bodies like the IMF and the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council have highlighted the quite high rates of claimants to case officers that are in Ireland, and have called for that to be increased, as has the chair of the government's own Labour Market Advisory Council. So that really is something that we kind of need to look at as well as having these training programs. We need to make sure that we have the structure in place to direct people towards these, and make sure that we don't leave people, young adults in particular, not taking part in the labour market for years to come. Secondly, really, that what I think the research highlights is that policies that act to tackle the root causes of high rents are going to be disproportionately benefit to younger adults, and particularly those younger adults who otherwise are being risk being left behind. So over recent weeks, there's been a lot of focus on the kind of the situation of those who have home ownership just within their grasp and who are kind of being knocked back from that. And that's an important situation, but it's important as well not to forget those who are far further from home ownership and their plight. They are exposed to a private rental sector that really has seen a big increase in prices. So we've seen in Dublin rents go up by 85% since 2011 at its trough. And so there really is a need, I think, to address the root causes of high rents there. And again, my colleagues at the ESRI, Conor O'Toole, Rachel Slaymaker and Kiernan McQuinn have done a lot of work in this area. So we know a lot of what is there to be done. And hopefully the idea of this report is to set out some of the key challenges and can, there is the scope there for policymakers to draw on other ESRI research into how we should address those. Those are the main implications of I think the key results in the report that I've drawn out for you. Thanks very much for coming along to the webinar this morning, and thanks again to the Community Foundation for Ireland for funding this research. Very happy, looking forward to your questions, and thanks again for coming along.
Great, thanks so much, Barra. Huge amount of material there. So you did a good job in getting it all in 20 minutes. And actually, really interesting point on the pensions and poverty, because I think sometimes when we're having these sort of events, you can be a bit depressed about the state's capacity, but you're absolutely right. Pension or poverty was a major issue, sort of going back to the 70s and the 80s, and the decision was taken that something was going to be done about this. That the pensions were increased, and there were still some older people in poor circumstances, but proportionately there was remarkable progress made in that, and you could say that was one of the great achievements of the state actually in the last 20 or 30 years. Okay, it's always tempting for me to take up our time, start engaging in discussion, but I better not, better keep moving. So listen, really delighted then to introduce Kiernan from One Family, who's going to give us a response, and clearly some of the issues that were raised there by Barra are very, very relevant to Karen and the people that she represents and her colleagues. So really looking forward to hearing your response. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for the invitation to speak, and I suppose to raise awareness of the issues affecting people who are parenting on their own, sharing parenting, separating. That's who One Family works with. We provide family support services to those people, and lots of relevant information in the report for us and other sectors, which we'll be able to use in years to come. So greatly appreciated and very timely, I think, given what we're facing coming out of COVID. So I'm going to start with COVID actually in terms of comments, and despite government putting a lot of measures in place to try and ameliorate some of the negative impacts last year, we still saw that things really worsened for one-parent families. And this is documented in previous research by ESRI as well as today. So we saw lots of parents losing their jobs because they were concentrated in precarious and low-paid employment that was particularly impacted. We saw schools and childcare just gone overnight. We saw people losing family and friend support and being extremely socially isolated and very anxious. We had service users who had to leave their educational courses because they couldn't manage to juggle things during COVID. Food poverty was one of the major issues, I think, that came through during COVID. It was obviously masked previously by schools, early years youth services, particularly hunger in children. We distributed vouchers for food, which we had never done before, and it was just a topic that came up in every meeting I think I was at for the first 6 months last year. That was coupled with difficulties for many parents of trying to get into shops because children were banned a year ago from many shops and many lone parents couldn't actually get in. We also saw that a lot of people who had child maintenance payments, they just stopped overnight due to unemployment, and there was a lot of conflict in families around contact and access visits. We're now worried about people in debt coming out of COVID, people with energy bills, with rent bills, and when evictions are lifted and moratoriums are lifted, we're going to see more problems, and I know colleagues in the sector are worried about that too. So last year we set up the National One Parent Family Alliance. So along with 8 other national organisations, we started advocating around the issues affecting one-parent families with government, and it's been a very successful model. And it just shows the level of seriousness that we all saw on the ground in terms of these families being impacted really, really heavily during the past year. We also saw that in terms of the massive demand for our services, particularly around helpline, parenting and counselling. But we also know, as Barra said, that one-parent families have been under pressure for many years. In fact, prior to the last recession, and I suppose those of us who have been around a while remember Budget 2012 and those cuts and reforms, as they were called, which just absolutely crucified many parents and families, and they're still trying to recover from that. So now we have a situation where one-parent families are 4 times more likely to live in consistent poverty than others. Most of the poor children in Ireland live in one-parent families. People parenting alone have less access to savings than anyone else. They're more socially isolated. The Indicon report done following the 2012 reforms found that of those activated into work, over 60% were living in daily deprivation. So that did not work. And we know that many of the problems are caused because some of the essential items for families, like somewhere to live and childcare, really need 2 good incomes to try and pay for them in this country. It is really difficult. Our social welfare system is also very complex and there are cliffs in it. Sometimes it interacts negatively with itself. And it's so illogical and so difficult to navigate, it makes a lot of people very fearful, and it makes vulnerable people more fearful. As was mentioned, jobless households are the most vulnerable to poverty and deprivation, and primarily they're lone parents and people with disabilities. Looking at the report, one of the things we found very interesting is that you identified children in lone parent households as a separate group. And this highlights that when we're talking about the issues of poverty, we're talking about two groups of people, and therefore it's a bigger and more pressing problem. And indeed, child poverty is a major issue of concern to many of us working in family supports and in the sector. I'm a member of the Advisory Council on Better Outcome, Brighter Futures, which is the National Children and Young People Strategy. And the single biggest concern and work of strategy for that council has been around child poverty, and we have a child poverty subgroup specifically to look at this. We're in the process of finalising 2 papers on child poverty to go to the Department of Children, and we hope that they can be used usefully then in that department's work around the EU Child Guarantee and in terms of developing a national child poverty strategy, which we badly need. My own view on that is that we need to target certain groups of children as well as then improving universal access to services and supports. So it goes back to that progressive universalism. Social welfare was discussed and how that can be very helpful. And I thought the example of how that supported older people was really interesting, because we know that the big losers in the recession were children. We know that the poorest children are in one-parent families, and we know that they are the poorest families. So it can be done. Social welfare can be used to mitigate. But despite the fact that we have literally a pile of government commissioned and government funded reports on lone parents and their children and what to do to support things, we're not seeing those recommendations being implemented, and we're not seeing the kind of evidence-based approach to budgets and policy making that we need. And that's very concerning. And one might be left to think, well, what's different about older people? They vote. Children can't vote. Sometimes their parents don't vote. You know, and we'd be worried, is there some kind of apathy? Is there some kind of discomfort about providing additional supports to people who are parenting on their own? You know, is there something still there in the psyche that is not actually going to where things need to be targeted? Because sometimes people need more support. So we do have the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Lone Parents in the Programme for Government, but that is absolutely critical to be systematically implemented, because that is kind of the policy issue that is there. Labour market was really interesting, what you were speaking about in terms of young people. And I suppose I just want to talk a little bit about labour market activation and employability programmes for lone parents, because they're a little bit different. And we have a lot of experience in this in One Family. We've run a number of employability programmes over the last 10, 12 years. And our focus is really an education first focus. We think that that's really important, because for parents to be able to build a career that is sustainable to lift themselves and their children out of poverty, they need to earn enough money. So in our New Futures programme, we have up to 90% progression rates out of that. It's a highly successful programme, and people generally move into further or higher education, with the minority going to work, but actually some of those then circle back to education, which is really interesting. And so we absolutely support the need that there needs to be investment in these person-centred employability programs. But for parents, we would be saying it should be emphasised around education first. And just to say, the programs we deliver have been funded by the EU for many years. They're not available, they're not funded by the state, and they really need to be available in a mainstream way. They're specialist bridging programs, combining QQI accredited training with individual key working with wraparound family supports. And that's what we find is highly successful for parents who are very hopeless, actually, a lot of the time when they come in. And we've had people say to us that those programs have saved their lives. They've given them confidence, they've given them access to college and grants and a job, and really, really given them a social circle, really transformed them. And that's what we need. And they take time and a bit of cost to do well. We note in the report that childcare is, of course, an issue for people parenting alone, has been for many years, and has increased poverty levels. And we know that previous activation policies haven't worked because there was no childcare in tandem with that. And we know that there's still ongoing problems for lone parents in terms of getting sufficient childcare so they can do education, so they can perhaps do any kind of work outside school hours. It's still really, really challenging. So I suppose all of this can seem really daunting. So I'm going to try and have a hopeful note here as well. I know you were trying to as well, Barra. So when we think about how to support one-parent families, and because many really live lives of daily struggle, and these issues of poverty, access to work, childcare, income security, they're dealing with those issues intersecting with other issues like family conflict, separation, domestic abuse, parenting, struggles through the family law system, such as it is, it's not really a system, shared parenting, homelessness. Like, there's just massive issues coming at people. We know that things are even harder for people from new communities or from ethnic minorities living in Ireland who are parenting on their own. And we know there are more people with disabilities who are parenting on their own. And there are more one-parent families with children with additional needs living in them. So there's a whole lot of really complex challenges there for people. But there are solutions, and we know from working with parents all the time that they're tenacious and they're ambitious and they want better lives for themselves and their children. But it's our responsibility to create the conditions that can help with that. So we need to implement the recommendations and all the numerous pieces of research that have been done. We need to have a really strong, high-level interdepartmental focus at government to do this. And we also need intra-departmental work, because some of them are so siloed, they are working against each other. So there needs to be a champion, and there needs to be support for that. We need to understand that people parenting alone and sharing parenting of their children face a different set of challenges than two-parent families, and they may actually require different and sometimes additional supports, and that has to be okay. That has to be okay in Ireland to do that. But most importantly, we need to focus on the children. There's 130,000 children whose lives are blighted and restricted because they are living in consistent poverty, and this is not right. We know that, and we need to do better as a country. So we have opportunities through child poverty strategy, through the EU Child Guarantee, and again, that's going to need interdepartmental leadership, political courage, and an entire government behind it to make it work. But this is the time to do it.
Great, thanks so much, Karen. Really appreciated that. And can I just say, I mean, I think the ESRI is very good at cranking through the numbers and providing the data, but there's nothing like getting a sort of a stronger sense of the lived reality for the people that we're actually talking about. So I have to say, really appreciated your contribution. The other thing I'll say, just as a small aside, obviously the Institute does a huge amount of work and a huge amount of areas, but I've often thought if our work in the areas such as child poverty, if it plays some sort of a role in identifying the challenges and sort of stimulating poverty action, I'd have to say, in terms of sort of organizational KPIs, that would be the best thing I think that we could possibly achieve. So anyway, thanks so much for your contribution. Okay, now it's my great pleasure to welcome Senator Lynn Ruane. So delighted, I know you're not formally in the Institute, Lynn, but delighted that you're coming to an ESRI event. Really appreciate it, and looking forward now to your remarks.
Thank you, Alan. I suppose last night I read through the report. I read the particular headings that I thought might, I suppose, stand out to me or might inform my contribution this morning. But I don't think I can ever truly prepare for the anxiety that actually talking about poverty actually has on me. So I've decided to bin the notes that I took on education last night and maybe talk a little bit more about just what's coming up for me really when I'm listening to the conversation. And you know, and like, I am so appreciative to be invited here. And I suppose I do value the work, I suppose, of the ESRI in pulling out that data, out those statistics. And obviously I've worked quite closely with Karen on one parent family stuff, and then obviously with the Community Foundation in terms of its investment in communities, in grassroots initiatives, and trying to really solve poverty from that kind of, you know, increase in participation and advocacy within community settings. But when I sit down and I listen and I really think about poverty and I really think about what it means and even how we measure it, it's like, you know, you can't come into my community anymore and measure poverty based on new shoes or clothes or luxuries, because I think many people have worked very hard to try and find money for luxuries, for new shoes, because it is what makes life bearable for people living in poverty. And then you're judged in a sense for trying to keep up with the Joneses, just for want of a better phrase. And it's like, so for me, when we measure poverty from that front, I think we miss large cohorts of people in terms of what people have and what people don't have. And then when we look at poverty through the financial lens and we don't really begin to address poverty through like poverty of information, poverty of access. Even if you do get people into employment, even if you do get people into education, there's so many different areas that communities are kept out of in terms of real progress. And I think we're very good at creating opportunities for some. So for some within communities, so if you use me as an example, somebody could point to me and the success, say, of An Cusain as a community education space, but also having free access to childcare. So for those 2 years that I had free access to childcare, I was able to get my foot in the door of education. Now, what would happen to me if I didn't have that? You know, I have no idea how I would have found my way kind of into the education system. So, you know, access to free childcare, not only for work, but also for education, and on the sites of education, whether it's community, universities, everything, and just removing the barriers at every single point of access into education or employment is a must. And we need to get to the point where we can't point to success stories anymore. You know, so if we're pointing to initiatives as being successful, are they really successful? Even the initiatives that I care about and I champion, are they truly successful? Or is it, are they, if a whole community can't transcend poverty, how are we measuring success in terms of improving people's abilities and life outcomes and their chances? Because we can't just lift some people and then say that particular initiatives or particular interventions are successful. We need to make them far-reaching so that a community can transcend itself in terms of moving out of poverty. And I suppose in the last few years, what I've noticed more and more is that tension between, that real tension between employment and education when it comes to solving the issue of poverty. And Karen mentioned education first, and I know Senator Higgins had to work really, really hard on the Social Protection Committee to get that concept into the heads of department officials, that, you know, and that tension is because, you know, employment figures look good for a government, you know, but it doesn't matter to a government what's behind those employment figures, if it's low pay, if we're addressing the wider impacts of poverty for those people or those communities. But if you can write on a page that someone's in employment, well, then that looks good for that period of time, regardless of whether there's another crash and them skills aren't transferable to anywhere else. So the education first as a concept is not necessarily supported fully by policy or fully by departmental civil servants, and it's something that we have to continue to push. And I think that's where the public narrative around poverty really needs to expand, to go, how do we really address it, you know, in its fullest sense, and how do we address public attitudes around what poverty is and what it actually looks like. I mean, you would hear a lot of dialogue from politicians or people who have had a more traditional route through life. So maybe they came from a professional background, or they went traditionally from, you know, Leaving Cert into third level. And you would hear a lot of them say now, oh, not everybody needs to go to college though. And we need to be very careful about who's saying that. Because if you come into my community, we're not saying that, because we want to go to college and we want to get an education. But then there's this public narrative being created that college is not everything. And it's, I don't understand why that's happening, you know, and it's only people that have actually got careers that required college, required university. And if they went off and traveled, they usually come from a professional background where there's a massive safety net to mind them if their risk taken in life to not go to third level fails, and they want to, you know, they're never at risk of homelessness, they're never at risk of comorbidity, they're protected in every other sense of the word. And it's like, we really need to challenge this concept of, you know, education versus employment, because education is what will keep us moving forward when the economy falls, when everything else falls. It will be education and transferable skills. And, you know, in our communities, we worked very hard to get people to Leaving Cert, because we told them their lives would improve if you just managed to finish school. So then we said, if you get a degree, you can then apply for the jobs that you used to have in your communities that didn't require a degree 20 years ago. We were the drug workers, we were the community workers, we were the youth workers. And then a system came in and professionalized those spaces. And then the programs that we created and we built up from the ground, we were told we weren't educated enough to run them.
Oh, have we lost Lynn?
But yet we were being told college, or else apprenticeships is something that can be brought up a lot. And I think we also really look at that conversation, because apprentice is a good thing, obviously, but it has to be a choice. You know, if someone wants to do an apprenticeship, it has to be that they're choosing to do an apprenticeship, not because the system has told them that their only option is to do an apprenticeship. You know, and if you go into schools that are more affluent and have more resources, you don't have the parents and teachers there peddling out apprenticeship, do an apprenticeship, be a carpenter, be an electrician, be this, be, you know, work in construction. But yet it is those people that are then in departments and in the public narrative around employment saying that apprenticeships is a really good thing to do, but not for their own families. And we need to make sure that we keep challenging that, because education or employment or what you do should be a choice. And if it's not a choice, it means you're being shoehorned. And I think that we need to keep trying to work hard to push that education aspect within departments and within the Department of Education, because I do think, you know, even if you look at all my friends who did apprenticeships growing up and managed to have a life that was, you know, was a good life, but as soon as anything falls, they are the ones that become unemployed. And without that wider education, they're more at risk then of homelessness, and they're more at risk of not being able to get back into the workforce, even with the apprenticeship. So I just think we you know, it's like, how do we really, really challenge that space? And I think even like, I think we've fallen into the trap over the years of looking at communities that are extremely impoverished, looking at community groups and looking to fund them to solve poverty. You know, a poverty that they didn't create and they don't have the means to fix, but yet we want communities and people in those communities to solve the big issue of poverty. And we never put people who have massive privilege in a room and ask them how they're going to solve the issue of privilege. And I think until we switch the conversation about how do we challenge privilege and how do we challenge fair resources and fair distribution and freedom of choice in what you do with your life in terms of education or employment, well, then we can't keep asking the people who have very little to solve the problem for themselves in their own communities. And I think even at that level, when we do engage with communities, there is gatekeepers that have developed within communities. And, you know, I think maybe Denise could probably, you know, speak to this as well. So when you look at funding or you look at philanthropy, I don't feel that philanthropy is going where it needs to go, because over the years, gatekeepers have developed, you know, the recognizable services have developed and really established themselves. And it looks in communities like there's only, say, 10 projects. You know, you could have a big youth service or an education, but actually, you know, people that are not from that community are sent in then to kind of go, tell us what's in that community and let's encourage them to apply for this fund to help them with education or employment or skills or personal development or whatever it may be. And they don't use the local knowledge there because they don't know the local knowledge. And sometimes it can appear that there's only like 10 projects. But if you ask the local person to walk you around that community, you would probably find 150 initiatives, ad hoc community people running different groups.
Okay, have we got a Wi-Fi freeze again for Lynn?
Even state. I think there's a whole sorry, what was?
No, actually, just your Wi-Fi broke up once or twice a little bit, but I think you're back on track.
You know what? I'm going to take that as a sign to stop ranting, right? And what I'm saying is that we need to, while we do the data, while we do the projects, while we do the funding, we need to challenge the narrative that education is not necessary to succeed, because it very much is. And I mean, you can be unemployed with a PhD these days. So I mean, the goalpost keeps moving. So I think we should be encouraging people into education, whatever that education looks like. Of course, it doesn't have to be third level, and not everybody will always move into employment, and that's not the measure of success. They might be able to better help their kid with their college work, with their school work, or advocate with a parent at a parent-teacher meeting, or be able to engage with the health service better. So education is not always about becoming an economic unit, but it's about being able to improve your personal circumstances even within your own home, and just how you engage in life and be in life. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Actually, I've got to confess here that I found your remarks on apprenticeship really challenging, because I have a sneaking suspicion I was one of those people with a third level education talking about the importance of apprenticeship. Now, I do still believe it, but the additional point you were making there about the vulnerability of employment and the extent to which, depending on your level of education, the more insulated you are. Because I don't know, the more time goes on, the more sort of you realize that people's well-being, so much of it is more about security than their actual income at about a point in time. It's really about knowing that you can look to the future with a degree of security. And I'm getting there's a very strong link between your level of education and your sort of vulnerability across economic cycles. But listen, we'll pick that up at another point.
But we really do support apprenticeships as well, but it's just how we sell that as a thing.
Yeah.
Do we reinforce inequality in terms of the groups that we target them at?
Yeah, no, I agree. We should do a pilot project that everybody who graduates from, I won't start naming schools, but we'll take a variety of private schools and we'll insist that all of them go on to apprenticeships or something like that for a few years, and we'll run a big social experiment or something like that to see what the effects of it would be. But no, listen, it was really challenging, really interesting, Lynn, so thanks so much. Really do appreciate it. Okay, so listen, we've got about 15 minutes for questions, and some questions have been coming through the Q&A function already. I'm going to remind people, if they want to be making comments over Twitter, it's hashtag ESRICFI. So I'm going to try and pick up some of the questions, and I'll direct them. I'm guessing a lot will go to Barra and his colleagues, but others may go more broadly. So the first one, Barra, it's real. Okay, it's a mildly technical question. Are the results on income inequality sensitive to the income indicator? Okay, and the specific question then is, if you look at gross income, and say you don't do equivalizing and stuff like that, does the pattern change much as you vary the measure of income?
So there's some work actually going on at the Institute looking more at that, about as you move to different units. So we've looked here at grouping together people in households, sharing that income between individuals in the household. That'll be coming out later in the year. We don't have any results on that, but in terms of actually the sensitivity indicators, no matter what indicator you use of disposable income, as is typically measured, inequality has gone down on that. So again, there's a huge amount of measurement issues here, but I don't think, income inequality as we typically measure it going down isn't inconsistent with groups being left behind, with other inequalities opening up, and with inequalities in areas other than income inequality being widening. So I think that's important to say. I think there's maybe a question there kind of about that later on as well. So very much our focus here is on kind of trying to, in terms of the standard measures that are typically looked at, bring them back as far as we can to kind of give a broad sense of how things have evolved. In the work program over future years, we're going to expand this, but we want to just kind of focus in initially on kind of those core indicators that are already used, but don't really kind of run back before the 2000s, so we can get some context for how things have evolved.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to pick up another very broad question. And this is from Paul Ganell from the Anti-European Poverty Network. Paul is asking, does the report support the case for social welfare rates to be benchmarked at a level that lifts people above the poverty line and is linked to the cost of living? For example, minimum essential standard of living. I guess we're moving into the territory there of living wages. So Barra, would you like to comment on that first? And if any of the other panelists want to come in there, is the implication here we need a living wage?
So I think there's certainly, what the report highlights is that for some groups, the rates of welfare payments that are there are probably inadequate to bring them above the poverty line or to lift them out of deprivation. So from that point of view, there's maybe worthwhile kind of an assessment of where these rates are currently set at. In terms of then, there's a kind of a linked question of how these rates should evolve. At the moment, and this is something that kind of we've always talked about at the ESRI, there's a bit of an ad hoc way that each year, a $5 extra is announced on each, for various different payments. And there's not a very sensible way of doing policy. That means that you have a bigger increase for lower payments than higher payments. It means that the proportion increase in those payments isn't the same. It means kind of weirdly that we're not linked, if we think we get payments at a certain level of living standards, and if prices are changing, it kind of feels like that should be automatically being lifted up. So that kind of question of indexation, I think, is a separate but important one to that of adequacy. But these are all things that I think are on the agenda to be discussed, and the Department of Social Protection have kind of talked about addressing some of these. But it does seem, I think, from the report there that there's maybe a case for revisiting those kind of core rates and the additional rates, and are we setting them at the right level? Because I don't think we've had really a systematic review of that, and for quite a number of years yet. It's really just been kind of piecemeal increases in bits of rates or the rates, and there's maybe is a case for looking again at where are the rates, where should they be at?
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to read out a comment from Nessun Vaughan, and one of the reasons I'm reading it out is it links to one of the themes that Lynn was talking about, and it's this sort of this broader notion of what poverty actually is. I'll just read the comment, and then the panel can react. So it's important to note that income inequality does not constitute the totality of inequality. Access to services, so education, health, transport, childcare, housing, impacts significantly on people's lives. Just to further, Micheál Collins, officer from UCD, produced a revealing report on behalf of the Society of Vincent de Paul on the hidden costs of poverty. Significant lessons to be learned. And I mean, Lynn, as you were talking, I was struck. I remember, again, with colleagues in the Institute working on poverty many years ago, there was this very broad definition that really poverty was about the inability to participate in the society in which you lived. And I know, sort of, Karen, again, some of the situations you were talking about. So do you want to, either Lynn or Karen, just reflect for a moment on that issue of access to services?
Yeah, I'll go first. Well, Lynn, I think I had mentioned that, say, if we were looking at a child poverty strategy, it has to look at access to supports and services as a bottom, and at a universal level where possible, and because that's a huge issue. So people often compare social welfare rates in Ireland to that in Britain, but actually, because they're higher here, but it's because we pay so much for universal services that they do not pay for. So if you look at the combination of services plus cash transfers from the state, it's higher in Britain, even though it doesn't look like that. So that's maybe one part of it. And then the other part of it is, of course, poverty is money, but it's also poverty of spirit, social connection, ability to participate, which is hugely important for children in society. And all of those things are just as important. But if you're homeless, you are much less likely to be able to participate in other things. And we've had really extraordinary situations where we've had people do a year-long employability course with us, and their address is room whatever in a hotel, because that's where they're living with their children. But they're there so long, they have made that decision to try and do something different to better themselves because they're stuck. So, it's a real testament to them that they are able to do something as draining and requires the level of participation that our New Futures does, whilst living in that kind of accommodation. For a lot of people, they can't think, they can't function when they're in emergency accommodation, that it's so difficult, or when they're in conflict or in and out of court. So anyway, I've probably digressed a wee bit there, but I think the point is well made. It's absolutely more than income.
No, not at all. Lynn, do you want to?
Yeah, I suppose services, obviously, it's wide ranging. So I'll focus on a couple, I suppose, that come up a lot for a lot of people that I would either support or engage with. And one of those is, assessments, health assessments, psychological assessments, and also, learning, it's stuff around learning difficulties. Once you, if you don't have the cash to pay for that, your child could be in, very, very well on into secondary school, their life has already been determined for them in some sense at that stage, before they've even, managed to make their way through a waiting list to see if there's any sort of, learning difficulties or disabilities. And I always compare my access to things like pre being a politician, and I can see the capital change, not only with having a wage, but having social capital and being able to pick up the phone and move my child here, there and everywhere, and just having that access to people, and I compare it then to being a lone parent on social welfare and trying to go in and engage with social services, or not social, with the local social welfare services, and you can't even hold a cup of tea in your hand. You're told to go outside and empty it, and you ask why you have to empty it. Why can't you drink your tea? The queue is really big, and you're basically told, no, it's in case you throw it at the staff, you know, and you're standing there and you're kind of going, excuse me? So like, even before you get to actually engage with somebody within the service, you've already been judged and stigmatized that you're a threat just because of, you know, your community that you live in, where the social welfare services is based, and somehow you're a threat. So you can imagine then even asking for help and support when you get to the window, when you've already been seen as something different when you walked into the door to the services. So I know someone mentioned caseworkers earlier on, and I kind of shuddered a little bit, because I was like, well, who would they be, and where would they be from, and how would they see us? And, you know, everything is behind a glass perspex window, and it's all very impersonal. So even being able to access services at the very point of just arriving in them can be an ordeal in themselves. There's a lot of families, obviously, with kids on the spectrum that don't even have a proper diagnosis yet in terms of being able to access speech and therapy or occupational therapists. And I mean, last summer I spent several trips putting friends of mine in my car with their kids and driving them out to my friend who's an educational psychologist. Now, 6 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to say I had a friend that was an educational psychologist. So just having that one friend that's an educational psychologist was able to improve their ability to be able to engage with services and what questions to ask, you know. So there's one thing, a state telling us that you have rights, but there's another thing being able to recognize what those rights are. So there's recognizing what those rights are, being able to exert those rights, and then being able to access them rights in their fullest sense. But unfortunately, when you have lived in poverty, and it's, especially when it's intergenerational, you don't even know what the rights are. You don't know where to look for them. You don't know what to Google. You don't know what form to even ask for. You don't know how to engage. You know, when someone tells you, oh, but all the information for the service is on the website, you're kind of going, I don't even know how to read that information. There's so much of it, like it could give you anxiety, you know. So even at that point of information, access to services is difficult.
Okay, thanks for that. Barra and the team got a couple of questions from Education with the Fiscal Council, and I'm going to try and summarize because they're quite long. But I suppose the question Eddie is raising is that you sort of paint this picture of low wages and stagnant wages for this younger group. Okay, but Eddie is basically asking, is it not still the case that the wages of this group could rise quite sort of successfully in the coming years? And just to add a couple of the points, like one of the things in the Celtic Tiger years, we worried about younger people, in a sense, being enticed out of the education system because there were such good wages to be made primarily on building sites. So you had a generation there almost who sort of left education earlier. One of the pluses of the recession, the Great Recession, if that's not a silly thing to say, is that, you know, people were much more likely to stay in education, and I think we saw that. So that you do have this sort of group who have accumulated a lot of education. So if you sort of project forward, is the picture as sort of bleak as the report might have suggested?
So potentially not, hopefully not. In terms of the education thing, so that it's true. What we saw was, particularly amongst teenagers, employment rates fell, and a lot of that was people switching into education, which we think is likely to be a good and positive thing into the future. But in terms of the people in their early 20s, it was still the case that in 2019, the NEET rate, so that's not an employment, education or training rate, so people who really weren't involved in any of those aspects, was about a third higher than it was in 2007. So that's kind of strips out that bit. That's the equivalent of around 30,000 more 20 to 24-year-olds in that kind of NEET category than you would expect had the labour market got back to where it was. So from that point of view, I think there is a serious concern there about the impacts of that, given what we know from other research internationally about the impacts that, you know, spells of that unemployment or experiencing those poor labour markets can have. So again, it hopefully is the case that, particularly for that younger group, that having stayed in education longer will protect them and will lead to better earnings and better outcomes in the longer run. But I think there is a reason for real concern because of particularly that NEET, that category of NEET in 20s, that hasn't come back to where it was. And I think that is what we do see is suggestive that there's some of these effects going on, which we again know from all other countries that can have really detrimental effects into the future.
Okay, there's still a lot of questions, and I'm sort of conscious that we'll be pushing up against our time limit. So I'm going to kind of broadly summarize one of the themes that's coming out, and it's a sort of an affordability question, I suppose. So to the extent, Barra, that you've talked about, increases in generosity or whatever like that. I mean, are these achievable goals in a budgetary sense, or are you talking revolutionary sort of notions?
I think the type of thing that we're talking about too, I think there's been maybe a movement towards in recent months, or even since the pandemic, there seems to be a very broad consensus on there's a need for more public services and more spending in lots of different areas. It's very rare, I think, now that you hear anyone talking about wanting to draw back spending in particular areas. So there's, I think, a fairly clear political consensus there of a larger state in lots of areas of life, and that, I think, extends to social protection. So from that point of view, then the real challenge is about, well, how do we pay for these things? And we'll have research actually next week coming out on options for paying for that as part of our budget perspective series. So I think there's some really huge challenges here in the years ahead about how do we address all the issues that Lynn has talked about and that Kiernan have talked about in terms of those services and making them more accessible and providing that support for people, and those additional supports that are clearly needed for those groups if they're to have their intended effect. So from that point of view, I think there's a big debate that is probably going to happen about, well, how do we then pay for these services and how do we push that out? So I think it's really, I won't go as far as revolutionary time, but I think it's quite a potentially radical time in terms of the role of the state, and that's not going to be the case just in Ireland.
Okay, I mean, there's two additional points, and I might just get you to comment, and indeed any of the other panelists, before we wrap up. The one issue is the extent to which, although we're talking about lone parents, there used to be a phrase in the United States that referred to the feminization of poverty. Okay, and then the extent to that lone parents are vastly disproportionately women, that there's a gender dimension on this, and I think this is as much a suggestion in the question. That because this is a difficulty facing women more than men, does that impact on the sort of enthusiasm for dealing with it? And the second issue, what I always find very, very depressing, is that we know, of course, that poverty is also closely linked to, bluntly, earlier mortality. That the health impacts of poverty really do accumulate over the life cycle. And just remarkable figures on the relationship between your income and education levels and the age at which people die. So it's extremely depressing, but probably worth thinking about. So I might go back to the Karen, Lynn, and Denise at this point. So the sort of gender feminization issues and the mortality issues. I'll go to you first, Karen. Don't feel you have to sort of tackle both of the issues, but if you'd like to sort of take a minute for a concluding remark.
I'll just speak briefly about lone parents and gender. And I suppose what we see is 85% of lone parents in Ireland are female, and the vast majority claiming social welfare, the one-parent family payment, are female. But that also disguises the amount of families that are trying to share parenting of their children to a greater or lesser extent, and to a greater or lesser extent of success, because the state doesn't recognise or support really shared parenting. The social welfare system doesn't really understand it, and people sometimes are punished in a way because maybe the other parent is involved in the child's life. That is also linked then to child maintenance, something which I know Lynn has been championing, as has ourselves in One Family and the National One Parent Family Alliance. We don't have a system, we don't have an agency, we don't have anything. And so people have to fight with each other in court all the time and privately pay to go to court to try and get child maintenance from a liable relative who's often the dad, not always. And there is no way of enforcing that. So many people do pay and participate in their children's lives, but many don't. And where it's done well, it is actually an anti-child poverty measure. and it is a way of decreasing the levels of poverty for children living in one-parent families. So whilst there is a gender dimension, it is also somewhat complex, and we don't have national figures other than one from GUI, which isn't fully national, around how many people are sharing parenting and what that looks like to them and how complex that is.
Just unmute myself. Thanks so much, Karen. Lynn, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just a brief comment really on the comorbidity rates amongst those living in poverty, not necessarily out of employment, those in employment as well, and low paid work. I mean, as a community worker in all the years that I've worked, I suppose, like for a 36-year-old woman, I've buried a lot of friends, both through the risk taken associated with poverty, which I suppose we don't always talk about. I think another impact of poverty is our risk aversion, you know, and because you're living you know, you're living in a particular way all the time, that you are much riskier in your behavior and your life, which can often lead to much younger deaths. But then the amount of illnesses that any one person has is and now with COVID, you can only imagine for those that are recovering from COVID and that are living in poverty with those they're already the comorbidities that they have.
Oh, have we lost Lynn again?
Have pause again?
Just a little bit.
Did I pause again? Did I pause again?
You did.
Yeah, I
did.
did.
I think there's a conspiracy. There's a conspiracy out. If I was conspiracy theorist, I'd be saying the state is out to get you.
But what I was going to say is,
you're too dangerous. But carry on.
Say like even in terms of access to medicine, like, or even someone's just everyday health, like a lot of people have a lot of like food tolerances, or a lot of people have allergic reactions, and you'll find people that are living in poverty can't actually even amend their diets. I mean, I don't like the price of living healthy is it's too expensive, or even, you know, gluten-free foods, dairy-free foods. I mean, you could spend €80 a week on just one child trying to actually address any sort of intolerances that you have, and families and people living in poverty just can't do that. So whatever about diagnosable illnesses and stuff that, you know, you can access in the health service, the very everyday living of just how you shop and what you buy and the impact that can have on a person's health is massive. So it is too expensive to live well.
Okay, and Denise, some final reflections maybe?
Yeah, no, look, just a huge thank you to everybody. Fantastic to be a partner, obviously, in the research. Huge thanks to Karen then and Lynn for really bringing it alive and putting some serious challenges out there to us, but also an indication of some solutions. So thanks a million to everybody, and brilliantly chaired as always, Alan.
Well, you're very kind. Denise, so listen, unfortunately we have to bring things to a close, but just a number of thanks again. Thanks to Denise and the Community Foundation for obviously participating in the launch, but also funding the work program. So we look forward to a continued engagement. Sincere thanks to Lynn and Karen for speaking at the event today. Just looking at the sort of comments and stuff like that, this was a popular event, and I have to say the discussion has just been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been very stimulating and very challenging, which is really, I suppose, the way things should be. And I think, again, we're going to be thinking and discussing these issues again for quite a while. I want to thank, obviously, everybody who's logged on today in such good numbers and for engaging. Really appreciate that. And finally, I want to thank Barra, but also Ivan Prevalko and Bertrand Maitre, who are the co-authors on the study. So I think I always make this point when it comes to the presentation. This can look very simple and straightforward, and I'm sure all you're doing is slapping up a few statistics and stuff like that, but huge amount of work goes into this. Of course, obviously data provided by the Central Statistics Office too, and others. So it really is. It's quite a mammoth task all in all, but it's just been fantastic all in all. So congratulations all around. Okay, so with that, we're going to sign off. So everybody, I hope you have a good rest of the day and an enjoyable weekend as well, and hopefully we'll talk soon. Okay, bye-bye.